All right, everybody, we got more great programming coming up, so please stick around right here. We have Gary Marcus. He is godfather of AI, came up the other day. I mean, just an amazing leader in the industry. One of the more rational voices, I think, out there right now when there's a lot of hype, a lot of bubble, a lot of pump up. But we're going to talk about why we need action, why we need regulation, why we need to think seriously about all this stuff, make sure we're doing it right. So Gary has some ideas, and he'll be joined by Ingrid London.
May I have your attention?
Okay, hi. Morning.
Hi there.
Hey, Gary.
Hey.
Fancy meeting you here.
Total coincidence.
Yeah. First of all, can I just start out by saying huge respect to you? Not for what you think. You think it's for me saying for you being outspoken about AI. Respect for that too. But this guy flew in overnight to get here to be on stage with us, so you guys could hear him, and I think that's pretty cool. Thank you very much for making the effort. And
story of my current life. Thank you.
Big respect. Yeah, I know you're a man on the move at the moment, I think. Okay, I'm just going to launch into my questions. First one is the only one I'm going to be reading out from my card, but because I think it needs to be read out, which is, in a world increasingly shaped by AI, you've been a vocal skeptic. Can you sum up your biggest worry about the future of AI in just one sentence?
It's going to be a long sentence with multiple embedded clauses.
Okay, you're allowed to put.
That's how I roll.
You're allowed to put a couple of semicolons in, but one sentence, please.
All right. My biggest short-term fear about AI is that misinformation, deliberate misinformation created at wholesale quantities is going to undermine democracy, and all kinds of things are going to happen after that. My biggest long-term fear is we have no idea how to control the AI that we're building now, and no idea how to control the AI that we're building in the future, and that lays us open to machines doing all kinds of things that we didn't intend for them to do.
Okay. Very, very good. Did you like the question?
Well, I don't like the limits, but I mean, it's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Steve Pinker did an interview with Colbert once, and Colbert said, explain how the brain works, and I think it was like less than 6 words, and Pinker sat there and he went, brain cells fire in patterns. It was pretty good, and so I kind of enjoy the challenge of that.
Okay.
We can do a lightning round of 6 words or less.
Okay. I'm asking if you like the question because I didn't write it.
ChatGPT wrote it.
ChatGPT wrote the question, that's right. But it took me many tries to get that question out. I asked it maybe 10 times, 15 times, and finally I realized I had to say the word punchy in order for them to not kind of waffle on and on, like I'm waffling right now. And it came out with a pretty good question, but I felt like it was important because that is the focus of quite a lot of your criticism at the moment, right?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of my career looking from a researcher's perspective at how humans understand the world, how they generalize, how they learn from data, and I had always been interested in AI, but stepped away from it for a while, partly because I didn't think it was very good, and then I returned to it when IBM Watson beat Jeopardy, and I was surprised by that.
What year was that?
Surprised. That was 2009 or 2010. Okay. And then I returned to the field, and I've spent most of my time thinking about how to make it better. And then ChatGPT came along, and everybody got excited about it. And what was a research question that was interesting suddenly became a social question because everybody's using it, but the technology is flawed for reasons that I've been writing about for a long time. It doesn't generalize very well, it makes stuff up, it's not reliable, etc. But it was okay as a lab technique where people just working on it, but suddenly you have 100 million people on it. What are the social implications of that? And then I got really worried after Kevin Roos had this crazy conversation that he wrote up in the New York Times where Sydney, part of Bing, told him to get a divorce and declared his love for him and so forth. And I'm not surprised that Bing did any of that, but what surprised me was that Microsoft didn't at least temporarily pull it from the market. I thought that Microsoft had put all this emphasis on responsible AI. They had pulled Tay a few years earlier when it had started spouting Nazi things and so forth. I thought, okay, you know, this was an experiment, and instead they kept it going and as too long an experiment, and I saw all of these risks. And I was like, if they're not going to be responsible about this, someone needs to speak up. And that really changed kind of the trajectory of my career, at least for a little while, to really focusing on what are the implications, what are we going to do about it, what policies do we need, how are we going to cope with this world. One thing I keep thinking is this is a dress rehearsal. Like, this is not AGI. This is not the Star Trek computer where you throw out a question and expect a correct answer. You know, you might get a right answer. You might have to fuss around and change the prompt and, you know, find the magic incantation of the word punchy, and maybe you get the answer you want. So this is not really the AI that we in the field have been striving for. But it is a dress rehearsal of, like, when we get there, are we going to know what we're doing? Are we going to have the right regulations, the right enforcement? Are companies going to take the right stance? Are they going to care about us or just the bottom line? And so, you know, it's a very interesting time, I think, from the perspective of the history of AI, which is not yet written. It's also very important. Like, I don't think we're doing that well with the dress rehearsal. What I see right now is a ton of negative externalities, a lot of bad things that are happening from these systems that society is just going to have to absorb and isn't really prepared to absorb. So that's where we are now, in my view.
It's funny you call it a dress rehearsal, because I was speaking with somebody from Sequoia yesterday, the big VC, and they'd done some research, and like apparently startups, we're not even counting OpenAI in this, who are the people who make ChatGPT, they've made like $1 billion in revenue collectively in the last year from AI services. So and a lot of generative AI services specifically. So there's quite a lot of money in it for a dress rehearsal. Maybe that's why Microsoft was loath to pull the experiment.
I mean, there's different ways to think about that number. So it's much more than the revenue we've actually seen from driverless cars, I think, which probably doesn't add up to the $1.5 billion or whatever that all adds up to if you include OpenAI. It's much less than the money that's being invested. There is a lot of, I think, right now, initial enthusiasm that may or may not be carried through. So a lot of people saw this graph where ChatGPT just kept going up and up. And then when June came around, it didn't keep going up and up, and in fact declined. And that, you know, tells us probably that some of the use was from students using it to write exam papers. They went away for the summer, they stopped doing that. And the students are not going to be big paying customers in the long run. And I think there's a lot of sense of people have played with it. They hoped it would become reliable, but it isn't really yet. So it's really good for programmers, because when it makes mistakes, which these things do, those programmers know how to debug. You don't become a programmer unless you know how to debug. Like, you'd be an excruciating profession if you couldn't. And so the programmers can deal with that. But in other domains, sometimes reliability matters. And so a lot of people are trying it. But I think the line, a lot of businesses, like, we're trying it now. Like, okay, is it going to, you know, get where they want to or not? That's still open.
Yeah, I mean, what are your bigger? Do you think that? I mean, when I saw the numbers go down in June for ChatGPT use, my first thought was, oh, finally, the hype is over. Because I get a bit annoyed by buzzy hype, and you just think this isn't sustainable. Then somebody else went, well, yeah, of course it's gone down. It's summer in school, summer session, no one's using it. Okay, so that's a kind of another argument to say, actually, it's going to pick up again now.
I mean, it's going to be interesting to see those data. I mean, other things have happened too, like you know, Meta has released open source models. If you want, all you want to do is to make up a term paper, and you are impecunious, as most, you know, undergrads or high school students are.
That's a great SAT word, by the way.
That's right.
Yeah, very good.
There's some kind of priming. I was thinking about the SAT. If you're impecunious, you're probably going to use the open source version, which was not available last year. And so, you know, I mean, from a business perspective, the question is, are there sustainable business models here? Who are the sustainable customers? So, you know, I noticed that OpenAI put out this projection that they would make $1 billion this year, and I really wanted to know, was that projection based on data through June or through August? But I don't think that's publicly available information. And there is this,
that's like... That's part of their black box.
That's part of the black box. There's so much that's opaque in OpenAI, it's kind of hard to not make that joke.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to go back a bit, and then we're going to go back again to the hype curve and so on. But all of this says to me, and how I started out, you know, making this reference to you taking a red eye. You were in New York yesterday. You're going to be somewhere else probably tomorrow. Next week you're going to be somewhere else. And without a PA planning it, even without someone managing your schedule or some, you know, for speaking opportunities, please call this person.
Oh, I do have an agent.
Oh, you do have an agent. Okay, you have an agent. You're really kind of like, you know, taking off. You've gone a bit viral, I would say.
I'm going to take that as a compliment.
Yeah, we've got a viral guy on stage here.
It's been a big year.
Yeah, it's been a huge year for you. Very, very big year. Which is quite interesting because you've been kind of complaining about stuff with AI for ages. And it definitely precedes ChatGPT. You've been pretty outspoken for a long time.
30 years.
Yeah, 30 years, right? And I think it's really cool, really interesting, because you definitely strike a chord. I think that loads of normal people out there, the reason why this goes viral is because you're probably speaking to loads of people out there who feel kind of like a latent sense of fear over, technology running amok and going ahead. And it's like the subject of tons of very famous sci-fi movies, and and everyone worries about Mother, and all that stuff. So you struck a chord, but not everyone is like your biggest fan.
Also true.
You've also struck a bum note with a bunch of people. And so what's really interesting is your background is not as an AI scientist. Your background really is in cognitive psychology, right?
I mean, it's a little bit of both. So I started coding when I was 8 years old on a paper computer.
Yeah.
And in high school, I did a lot of coding, learned a bunch about AI. I actually skipped the last 2 years of high school, went straight to college, and that was based on a piece of AI that I wrote, which was a Latin to English translator that I wrote in Logo, which was the closest thing I could get to Lisp, which was kind of the language du jour. And so I've been thinking about these things all my life, but I took a detour from it for a long time. In some ways, I got really re-immersed in AI in 2014 when I started an AI company that did machine learning. I helped devise the algorithm that we used with Zubin Gharamani, who's now over at Google, very well-known ML researcher. And I've been fully immersed in AI for the last decade or so. So I had an early period where I was a coder building the stuff myself, and then a later period where I've had, entered in many different ways. And in between all of that, I really dedicated myself to understanding how children understand the world and how they understand language. And I often think of Joseph Conrad wasn't a native speaker of English, but he had a different perspective. I have an outsider's perspective on AI, which is how do humans do this? How do the machines stack up against the humans? What can we learn from what the humans do? Some of the most relevant work that I did was in a 2001 book that was really about human cognition, but juxtaposed against neural networks that were the predecessor of what we do now. And one of the most prescient things I said there was that these systems would hallucinate. I didn't use that word, but I walked through an example. I said that they don't understand the difference between kinds and individuals. So, this bottle as opposed to that bottle. I want to keep track of mine. I don't want to share germs with you, no offense. We only just met. And so I want to, track this individual as opposed to the kinds. And I made the point that these kinds of neural networks don't do that very well. They don't really have a systematic way of doing it. They don't have databases. People imagine that they're sort of general purpose intelligences that can do whatever you do, and you might have a database in your head, which Daniel Kahneman wrote about with Anne Treisman in the psychological literature. These systems don't have that. And I said, as a consequence, they're going to hallucinate. I gave the example, if my Aunt Esther won the lottery, these systems would think that lots of people maybe of her age or where she lives or of her profession also won the lottery, whereas we know that's a fact that is specific to a particular individual. And sure enough, this is exactly what's happening 20 years later. Like in my TED Talk, I gave the example of one of these systems saying Elon Musk died in a car crash. Well, it's generalizing from a cluster of words that are put together, Elon Musk and a bunch of other, rich white guys in California, some of whom died in Teslas. And it's also putting together kind of the CEO of Tesla with owning an individual Tesla car. It doesn't understand any of that. It winds up with this crazy hallucination. And so some of the work that I was trying to understand, from a psychological perspective, how do you build a model of mind, is extremely relevant to the situation we have right now.
Yeah, okay. So all that being said, though, you have had, the criticism has been that you're coming at it from this perspective. You don't really understand.
It's a stupid criticism.
Okay, you call it stupid.
Well, I mean, look at
Jeffrey Hinton.
Look at Francis. Well, some of the things he says are. You can quote me on that, but I get to elaborate.
Yeah.
Francis Crick, for example, was a physicist, and he was one of the great biologists of all time, certainly of the 20th century. And he helped drive multiple revolutions, from finding the structure of DNA to figuring out what the code was. He was a physicist. Nobody ran around saying, "Hey, Crick, you don't have a degree in biology."
Right.
They said, "What is the work? What have you discovered? What have you figured out?"
So you feel that it's unwarranted.
It's ridiculous.
You haven't tried to bury the hatchet with these guys, the ones who are out
I've
there
tried,
kind
but
of
they don't want to.
dragging your name through the mud and stuff like
They
that.
don't want to. I mean, like LeCun, for example,
Jan LeCun. Wait, say who it is.
Jan LeCun, he's the chief science officer at Meta.
Yeah.
He's so threatened by me in multiple ways that he went around saying that I have no publications, no peer-reviewed publications in the AI journal. He said this in a written interview. I'm blanking on the name of the journal.
Tech Review, maybe? MIT?
No, it wasn't Tech Review,
Anyway.
but it was a fairly big place. And
Not TechCrunch.
Tiernan Roy writes for him. Sorry, I'm blanking on the publication. But he went and he said, Marcus has no peer-reviewed publications. He just made that up. It's not true.
Yeah.
I had to write to them, and they had to make a correction. It was just a lie. Another time he said that I invented this important tension between symbolic AI and neural network AI. In fact, that tension has existed since the 1950s.
Right.
Like he just can't deal with the fact that someone else who was at NYU is prominent and has an opinion here, and so he's done a lot of ad hominem arguments. Ad hominem arguments are never the right arguments. The question is, what is correct? I'll give you another case of him.
Well, I mean, you're also undermining a lot of their work. I mean, it's.
Here's where the real irony.
It's to be expected that if you're picking up traction from what you're saying.
Yeah, LeCun is a really interesting case because I critiqued a lot of this stuff in a 2018 paper called Deep Learning, A Critical Appraisal. And Eric Brynjolfsson, who's an economist who works on AI, immediately tweeted about it and said, "This is a really interesting essay." And LeCun couldn't handle that. And so he immediately wrote back and he said, "Well, it's mostly wrong." And I kept asking him what's wrong about it. And what that essay said is basically that things like large language models aren't really getting us to AI. And he never spelled out his argument. He told me I was fighting a rear view battle. And then when ChatGPT eclipsed Galactica, LeCun suddenly said all the things that I have been saying all along.
Right.
I said deep learning is hitting a wall. He said deep learning was an off-ramp to AGI. Like, there's no real difference between them. It got so extreme that I ran a Twitter poll and I said, what explains Jan LeCun's recent tweets? And the winner was ChatGPT trained on Gary Marcus tweets. So, like,
oh my God.
It's not that there's an intellectual argument there that he is stuck to. It's about ego.
Okay, so doesn't sound like the hatchet has been buried at all. Like you guys it's still a kind of like real time.
That one's not going anywhere. Yesterday he tweeted, he said that the only people that spoke in the...
Just yesterday?
Yesterday.
Oh my God.
I didn't respond to him, but he said the only
realize.
people that had spoke in the Judiciary Committee were mostly doomers, scaremongers, and people for strong regulation. He said this in reference to me. I am actually for strong regulation. I'm not a doomer, but he tried to couch it like, we didn't have anybody worthy. Actually, it's really important to talk about strong regulation. But he went after me unsolicited by me.
Let's talk. I was going to ask you about regulation later. Let's ask about it now since you brought it up. I mean, we have been seeing a ton of moves from the government, bringing together these summits with, the AI summit in the UK is coming up. It looks like it's so important. We've got actually the chancellors in the Valley right now trying to talk to AI companies, from what I understand. And, it's a big thing. And then you've got, regulation is at the door. People are coming and speaking in Congress and so on. Where do you think all of that's going to go? Do you think that any of that is going to have legs or teeth or anything to kind of, bridle in the...
I don't know. I'll start by saying this. The worst thing I think we could do is to not regulate AI at all. There's a lot of techno-libertarians taking that stance, and I think it's ridiculous. We regulate bread, we regulate medicine, we regulate airplanes. The reason that I felt comfortable taking a red eye last night is because we regulate airplanes. If there was no regulation, I wouldn't step on one of these things. I would be like, I can't get there tomorrow, I don't trust this. So we regulate any serious technology because there are always issues. And with airplanes, we regulate how they're built, how they're designed, how they're tested, how they operate from one month to the next, what maintenance schedules there should be. Like, there's tons of regulation. It's just absurd to think that we should have no regulation on a technology like AI that is increasingly general purpose, spread through the world, adopted by hundreds of millions of people. I think that's just a crazy view in my perspective. But the second worst thing that could happen, and it drives some of the reason why people make the crazy claim, is that we could wind up with regulatory capture, which is to say that the big companies make the rules, they stifle innovation from the smaller companies, the governments just kind of do what the big companies want. And that is a real risk. So when I see closed-door meetings that are dominated by big tech CEOs with hardly anybody else in the room, I get worried. Or when I see photo opportunities that are, leading officials of major countries and they don't have any scientists in the room, I get worried.
Yeah, what do you think, though, when even the companies that you kind of would probably name as the ones that are very ripe for regulation, like OpenAI, then kind of take the stance of, we need to be regulating it? Yeah, we agree. Do you think that it's disingenuous just so that they can get in the room and actually do
It's hard to say.
reverse tactic there and make
I got to watch Sam Altman up close when I did Senate testimony right next to him. And I think that he was sincere on the one hand about wanting regulation. I think he genuinely worries about long-term risk, about elections and misinformation. He does not want to be seen as the person who destroyed the world. And yet at the same time, he runs a big business and he wants it to do well. And so, I think it's possible for a person to have two sets of beliefs or motivations at the same time. And I think that Altman's case in particular, that he genuinely does want to see this land in a good place, but he also wants to see his company land in a good place and wants to have power. And you can look at what he's doing with his orb thing and so forth. And so, some of what I think
Don't get me started on the orb.
Well, you have to take that in context, right? The orb thing is disconcerting in terms of privacy and surveillance and so forth. So I obviously don't agree with him on everything, or probably even most things. I also don't agree with him on the technical matter, and we could talk about that. But I do think he actually wants regulation. Famously, Zuckerberg went to the Senate and talked about regulation, and I don't think really wanted it. I think Altman actually does, but at the same time, backstage, his company lobbied the EU to soften the regulations and so forth. So it's a very complicated situation there. And the lobbying groups of these things are amazing. I was in Washington recently. I stayed at a hotel that was as close as I could to the Capitol, and it was right next door to the major lobbying organization for one of the major companies. They are there, right in the mix with, these huge operations, and they have a lot of power, and they have, former employees, peopling the White House and so forth. So regulatory capture is a big thing. I didn't really answer your question, though. So I started to answer it. So I'm very worried about regulatory capture. I do think something is going to happen, that we will not have an entirely unregulated industry. But what I'm seeing...
Do you think it's going to come anytime soon, though? I still feel like it's very early days for AI, despite how much it's in the press. And so much regulation really comes, maybe too late. It's kind of interesting how early government is getting in on the game.
There's a real sense in Washington, and I think other places in the world, that we did, or they did, a terrible job with the internet and social media.
Terrible.
And they'll cop to that, And so they want to do better here. And that's why they're having hearings and trying to figure something out. They don't want a repeat of that. They know they did a bad job. And that might move things along, but then you have other forces that go in other directions, like ego, right? So, every person involved wants to have their own set of rules and laws. That's probably true of me, too. I have my ego involved. And so there's some lack of coordination. I keep thinking about street basketball, where some of the players are incredibly talented, but nobody wants to pass the ball. That's kind of what I'm seeing right now.
Right. It's kind of interesting, too, because I feel like, one of the kind of great issues with regulation and how when government gets involved in tech is that you start to wonder, with ad tech, it was a big thing for me. It's sort of hard to understand it for even people in the tech world sometimes, what's going on. And then they would do those, those judiciary committees, and they would be asking the most elementary sounding questions, practically, what is exactly this internet?
Senator, we sell ads.
What is a banner ad? Senator, we sell ads. Yeah, that was the crux of it all, And it, you sort of think, oh my God, they don't understand what they're trying to fix, And then you think, oh God. Then with AI, wait, let me just say, one of the things that you're starting to see is this, they're going in it as total doomers, in the UK, there's really, where I live in London, it's a existential threat. They see it as existential threat. They don't have a nuanced view of what's good, what's bad, What do you think of all that? Do you think that they're coming at it even with the right attitude? What do you think of that whole existential threat argument.
Well, so there are two parts to your question.
Yeah.
One is
Thank you
about
for breaking it down.
One is about existential threat, and the other is about just competence and
Yeah.
understanding. So I'll take that one first. There are some people in Congress who have actually immersed themselves. So Richard Blumenthal, Senator Blumenthal, for Connecticut, has really immersed himself in this stuff.
Yeah.
He convened the proceedings I was in, and then I was in another private session with him. He clearly is following what's going on in a fair amount of detail. And there are a lot of senators who have some staff on this right now. Some of those staffers are very good, really understand what's going on. And then there are a lot that don't understand. And I think part of what we need is to realize that we shouldn't have the Senate be parsing, for example, GPT-5 versus GPT-4. Like, there's no way they're going to have that level of competence. And what I think follows is actually we need an agency where there are a bunch of full-time people whose job, and probably a cabinet level secretary or something like that, whose job is to understand both the risks and the opportunities. How can we save money for the United States by using AI in the right way? Where will it be unreliable and cause bias and so forth? So we need people whose full-time job is to understand this whole picture. And they have to be able to move more quickly than Senate can. And this actually came up in the testimony, or in the session rather, that I was in the hearing. The senators themselves acknowledged that. They said, what we do is we build lasting institutions. We're not here to micromanage by day. That has to be part of how we do this. Same thing in the EU and so forth. The EU AI Act has a revision process that built into it, so they can reconsult it. And some authority has to be given to agencies that can be more dynamic. So that's part one of your question. Part two of your question is, yeah, I think the UK is moving a little bit towards the doomer side of the spectrum. I think doomer is like shorthand for worrying about long-term risk and so forth.
Yeah.
I think we have to balance the risks here. I think within the field, there's a very unfortunate battle right now between people who are calling themselves AI ethicists and AI safety people. And they each want to say, worry about the risk that I'm thinking about and not the other person's. And there's been some nasty dynamics there. And I think of it as sort of like, as if people who worked on car accidents said, don't look at cancer, that's a long-term risk, it takes a long time. And the cancer people said, don't look at short-term risk because many more people die of cancer. They're both real, they both need to be studied. We need to study the short-term risk, which include the possible undermining of democracy from misinformation, which is a huge and very real risk. And we need to look at long-term risk. What if we build these systems and people repurpose them for bioweapons? What if we just completely lose control of the systems because we don't know how to program our objectives in very well? We need to look at all of that stuff. I think the UK at the moment seems to be more towards the long-term end of the spectrum. The Blumenthal-Hawley bill that was just proposed, bipartisan, is actually more on the short-term side of perspective. And we need some balance there. And it's very difficult to get, again, it comes back to egos, to get the individuals involved to say, yeah, I'm working on X, but Y is really important too. We really need to do X and Y, but we do.
So my theory, by the way, on why there's so long-termism about this stuff is because there's real business opportunities in the short one. I think that, there are businesses that are building things, and I think that they see opportunities for industry in the UK where the short term can apply. And I reckon it's something like that.
There's a bunch of different theories there. They're probably all in part true. So one theory along the lines of what you're saying is we don't know how to ameliorate the short-term risk. The big companies don't really want to call attention to that and all the negative externalities of what they're doing. So they talk about the long-term risks that are a little bit more abstract and that maybe gives them a little bit of control. So there's definitely like a cynical aspect to it.
Yeah.
I think there's some genuine concern by some major figures in the UK I won't name for the long-term risk, and those people have influenced the people that they have spoken to in the government. So some of it comes from a place of genuine concern, some of it comes from a cynical place about what we should do, and some of it converges. And then I think the UK is like, what's our play in this?
Yeah.
And they think that they have a play there.
Yeah. So you brought up agencies, by the way, in the first part of the answer. You were part of I think some people calling for this idea of an international agency.
Yes, including Anka Royal, who's sitting somewhere out there. Maybe.
Hey, I see someone waving there. Hey.
Anka and I wrote a piece in The Economist in April.
Yes, that's the one. Yeah, it was really interesting. And how realistic do you think that could be? I mean, or do you see this potentially as something that has to be done on a kind of national level? Well,
I don't think that's an either or, first of all. So I think every country should have a national AI agency, and I think we need some kind of global thing. When we wrote that piece in April, I also gave a TED Talk the same day, April 18th. as the Economist thing came out. When we wrote it, it felt a little bit like a fantasy. Like we were trying to get the world to think about it, but I
Like
didn't.
a thought experiment.
It was more than a thought experiment. It was like, hey, we should really do this. But I wasn't very confident. I'm a little bit more confident now. A lot of people are actually speaking up for this idea, most notably the Secretary General of the UN, your Prime Minister.
Have you talked to the UN about it? Like, do they have an appetite for this sort of
They
thing?
have a huge appetite. I was there. That's why I was in New York, actually, as I was at a, I guess I can say this publicly. I was at a side session, I guess, of the UNGA. It was all about this. The tech envoy convened it, who reports directly to Guterres. And there was a really all-star cast in the room. I don't think I'm really at liberty to say, but it was amazing group of corporate people and AI ethicists and so forth. It was a very serious showing. It was probably 100 people, and
wow.
It was almost like a who's who. So they're pretty serious about it. They're convening what they're calling, I guess, a high-level advisory body. I guess they revealed yesterday, maybe not publicly, a time schedule for all of that.
So what is the time schedule? Where are we seeing?
I'm trying to think what I can say.
You can say.
I don't.
It's just you and me talking.
Yeah, it goes out on Twitter. It's a pretty accelerated schedule. I mean, they want to get this thing together very quickly.
But are
they
we
want to
talking months or years here? Or
It's a schedule that is delineated in months, not a schedule that's delineated in years.
interesting. And the thing is how is it going to have any teeth to do anything? What's the
Well,
idea
I mean, in principle, you have all the world's countries involved in the UN. They have a large, moral force.
Right.
They can stand up a new organization or use an existing organization. They have an ability to convene people that's kind of unequaled. They have a lot of force. They also have a lot of problems. They know that. It's not, I'm not revealing anything secret or unknown to them. There are a lot of complications there, but I think there's an opportunity for them to do some real good. There are a lot of questions about, what authority any such entity might have and how it would be structured. And I think people get caught in those details. But the most important thing is we're heading towards a world where we have AI really broadly distributed through society. We're not really well controlling it. It's not very reliable. And we don't have structures in place for countries to talk to each other. I don't think that current AI is very intelligent. I think it's dumb in a lot of ways. There's some people who think like AGI, artificial general intelligence, is a year or two away. I don't think that it is, but it will come, and we need to be prepared. This goes back to the dress rehearsal idea. We should be building structures now where countries can convene and compare information. And also, just a side note, but a really important one, we don't want 195 countries training we don't want 195 countries with 195 policies requiring each company to build 195 models. They take an enormous amount of energy, they take a lot of water, they're really not good for the environment. If you have to retrain for each country differently and maybe California differently from Illinois, like that's a disaster for the environment. So that's also a reason to have some international standards so that we don't do new models for every jurisdiction.
I just think, personally, I just feel like, business interests and, enterprise is going to outstrip some of these kind of great ideals. But
that is the default, is absolutely what we should be worried about. That's regulatory capture, again, to use that jargon term. We should be 100% worried about that. It's a lot of what I spend my time thinking about. Mentioning Anka again, we're trying to build an organization called the Center for Advancement of Trustworthy AI. And part of what we're trying to do is to build a way of what we're calling regulation or governance in a box. And governance in a box, what that is we give a smaller country everything they need to regulate AI, because most countries don't have what they need.
Is this going to be a startup? Or
It's going to be a nonprofit.
is it going to be a nonprofit OpenAI style, where it starts as a nonprofit and then becomes a startup?
I really hope not. I really, really hope not.
And then raises
not one that calls
billions
itself
from
open
Microsoft?
and is actually closed and kind of leads the Orwellian
black box.
doublespeak Olympics. We don't want that. We want to be fairly open about what we're doing. We intend to be a nonprofit. Media Network has given us our first tranche of funding.
Oh, okay.
So we're already launched.
You do have funding then?
So we have a small amount of funding, and we're about to, we're working on a grant proposal. We're almost done, and we want to raise a considerably larger amount of funding. But anyway, just to wrap the thought there.
It is a startup.
I mean, a nonprofit is like a startup, right? It's not a for-profit startup. The idea is that we can build regulation externally that we propose to the country. The countries still have to adopt it, but we can be more independent, free of regulatory capture, not coerced by the companies, and maybe keep us from that scenario.
Yeah, your total addressable market, as a VC would say, is a very limited amount of places, however many countries there are in the world. But yeah, it's very interesting.
We're not here to make money.
Yeah.
We're here to make a thriving
know,
AI world
yeah.
that is safe for my children and any future children that she
That
might
was a
have
cheap
and so
shot.
forth.
I'm sorry. That was me making a cheap startup shot. Listen, I do want to ask you about startups very quickly because this is a startup conference. You have been involved in two before.
Sorry?
I just had a question for you about the first one of them, which was
Geometric
intelligence. You were co-founder and CEO. You guys were acquired by Uber.
Yep.
And then you joined, and you had big plans for building out their AI muscle, and you were going to be like, Travis's AI whisperer. And then you left after 3 months. Can you just kind of tell me what happened and why you left? I never really knew.
I mean, in 3 letters, NDA. So no, I can't
Okay.
really. But there were differences of opinion.
It was just differences. Does it go back to a lot of what we've been spending the last 40 minutes talking about, or was it other stuff?
Yeah, there were many differences of opinion.
But I mean, can you say, does it have to do with some of these bigger ideals?
I can't.
Yeah, I know. No, I'm not asking, did you and Travis disagree about the kombucha in the fridge? But I'm asking.
We did, but.
Yeah, oh God, I thought so. Yeah, I understand. I feel
It wasn't just
Yeah.
Travis. I mean,
Yeah.
there were politics about what the company would be doing and I went in with a vision, and it was clear that the politics relative to that vision were much more complicated than I initially anticipated.
Okay, you did leave and then start another startup, which was
Yeah.
Robust.AI, which
Yeah.
you then also left. And that's raised money earlier this year, so it's still
Yeah,
very much going.
it's still thriving.
Yeah, it's like more of a robotics.
Yeah, they've
startup.
moved towards warehouse robotics,
Yes,
which was not
exactly.
initially where I thought we would go.
Yeah.
But they're working hard on that.
Right. But what's interesting to me is you coming into the entrepreneurial world in AI, having been a critic of it preceding that,
Yeah.
going in and going out and becoming actually an even stronger critic of it. So I just have been wondering,
Nothing I
as
learned
was
in
thinking
industry
about-
has made me a less strong critic. I mean,
Say it again. Wait, nothing that you've did.
nothing that I learned in industry made me a
Right.
less strong critic. I
Did
mean,
it
like,
make you a stronger
watching
critic,
driverless
though?
cars up close did not give me more confidence in driverless cars. for
Right.
example, right?
I mean, is part of the reason why you are kind of on the sort of campaign? I mean, you're not even a professor anymore. You're literally.
I retired after selling
Yeah,
the
you're,
first company. but-
yeah, you're literally out there using your time and resource and your kind of voice to speak out, and you're making like a Gary Marcus, the figure is known for that. Like, so, is that? I mean, you are a bit like your own startup in a way, in that sense, a nonprofit. I don't know what you would call it, but
I
you
mean,
know.
I've been running this mostly at a loss. I did almost everything I did this
like
year.
every startup, you are a startup.
I did almost everything pro bono this year.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't pay you to speak in front of the Senate.
Yeah.
Now I have a little bit of funding that's paying for my expenses.
Yeah.
But
So my question really is around that. Like the reason I'm bringing it up is like, do you see like what is your kind of vision of where kind of AI as an entrepreneurial activity can go? Because you've clearly tasted it and walked away and a couple of times, and now you're
I'm
really
not saying I
speaking out.
won't go back, but right now I think the need to have good regulation around AI is so urgent.
Yeah.
I think so much is at stake in what happens in the next 3 or 4 years. And I made enough money from the first company that I have freedom to do what I think is the most important thing in the world right now without worrying about the economics.
Yeah.
And the most important thing, and I have a 9 and a 10-year-old, is to try to make a world for AI where humans can thrive. And I don't think that's the default. I think it's possible,
Yeah.
but we really need to work at that. We cannot take that for
Yeah.
granted.
Okay. I think that's a great way to end this. I thank you so much for talking.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening, you guys. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.